So it's been reported this weekend that Winnie Mandela, or Winnie Madikizela Mandela, as she preferred to be known after her divorce, has passed away at the age of 81. Now, the coverage hasn't been quite as prominent as the death of her famous husband, but it has attracted significant coverage because Winnie Mandela was a very notable person in her own right and a very controversial figure. You cannot talk about Winnie Mandela without talking about controversy. So I just want to talk a little bit about this, a little bit about the current situation in South Africa, and just some of my own observations. Firstly, let me be absolutely clear. I think apartheid was a heinous system. I think it was vicious, cruel, guilty of the worst sort of racial polarization, and I think that's something that should never be forgotten. South Africa was not a democracy during apartheid; it was white minority rule. But that's all already well covered. When her husband was in prison, and it should be said Mandela was significantly older than her, without question, she was a very staunch supporter, and he said that he could not have got through those years at Robben Island without her help, without her support. And indeed, the world knows those famous images in 1990 when he left Victor Verster prison, fist clenched in the air with Winnie Mandela by his side. There's no question about it. She was a very formidable woman, a very, very headstrong woman, and in her own way, certainly she did show extreme bravery throughout her life. Um, in the early years of the struggle, especially, she suffered serious humiliation, beatings, even torture when she was arrested and incarcerated at Pretoria prison. I think this is important to understand where her hatred and her rage came from. Important to understand, but not necessarily a justification of some of the things she went on to do, because there have been other prominent leaders and people in high positions who went through extreme personal suffering but didn't take that approach. Of course, her husband is one of the most famous, but also another example I would quote is Dilma Rousseff in Brazil. She suffered torture under the military junta there, but was she may have been corrupt, but unlike Winnie Mandela, she, as far as I know, was never accused of serious human rights abuses herself. Now, Winnie Mandela took a very different approach from her husband. At some point in the mid 80s, as Desmond Tutu pointed out, she was an icon for the anti-apartheid movement, but something went terribly wrong, and he used the past tense. Um, in about the mid 80s, something started changing, and whether it was always there or whether it was coming through the surface, there'd always, I think, been marital tensions between Nelson and Winnie. Um, Great man as he was never an outstanding husband. That's something that's perhaps a slightly less honourable side of Mandela. But then again, she wasn't always apparently such an outstanding wife. Nevertheless, she certainly sacrificed for him insofar as being the front of the anti-apartheid movement. But in the mid 80s, things I think started. She became more a vigilante than a freedom fighter, and that was very clear. She took a radically different step from her husband. I think Winnie Mandela just wanted revenge. Her husband saw the bigger picture. He prevented civil war in South Africa, which makes him one of history's great figures. But I mean, take for example the policy of necklacing. She never denied it. When she stood up in 1986, the year after, ironically, winning the Robert Kennedy Human Rights Award, the irony is incredible. She stood up and said, "We do not have guns, but with our necklaces, we will," forget the exact quotation, but we will shake off apartheid. Now, this savage policy of necklacing was not directed at the white minority. It was directed at poor fellow blacks. And apart from being absolutely savage in what took place, the fact that you would have a tire put around your back, you'd be chased by a mob, you would have a tire put around your neck, covered in oil, set on fire. Absolutely savage. Now, this was not unique to South Africa. There were examples of this taking place under the Duvalier regime in Haiti. There were possible examples during the Sri Lankan Civil War. Um, and there have been examples in terms of vigilantism against drug dealers in the Ivory Coast, in Nigeria, in Brazil, as an internal crime system of punishment. There was an investigative journalist in Brazil who famously suffered this horrible ordeal. When the BBC was covering this, they showed stock footage of a guy being chased. They didn't show the act itself, but they showed him right up to the point with the tire around his neck, and it was, well, actually not around his neck, around, like, basically you were wrapped in the tire. Savage, absolutely savage. And for her as a public figure to stand up and condone that, I feel is definitely something that should never be forgotten and utterly shameful. And it went further than that. She always denied her involvement in the so-called Mandela United Football Club, but I think the evidence that she was promoting that sort of vigilantism and the famous killing of the young teenager um, Stumpy Sepai was, I think the evidence is very strong of her culpability. Some of the culprits did serve prison sentences. Winnie Mandela got away with it. Then again, there was her corruption. Without question, she was corrupt. She was arrogant. She saw herself, I feel, as a sort of queen of South Africa, a queen of black South Africans. And I think she utilised that because she was genuinely popular, especially among poor black South Africans. There's no question about it. But Oliver Tambo in the ANC said, we have no control over her. So she was, I'd almost compare her on a smaller scale to the sort of way that Chairman Mao turned the party against itself. Winnie Mandela was bigger than the party in a sense, and she didn't really care what they thought of her. An incredibly stoic woman insofar as the personal ordeals she went through, but then she became an incredibly arrogant woman and definitely a demagogue without question, and that is something that cannot be airbrushed from her history. The fact that she was driving around in white limousines and pampering herself when black South Africans were still living in chronic poverty. The fact that she was accused of misappropriating, for example, welfare funds. This is all something that really does, I think, cast a dark cloud over her legacy. Um, I suppose one thing that can be said about Winnie Mandela, she was stoic. She was a tough individual, especially given the personal ordeals that she went through. I think at one point she said, "Nothing scares me anymore," and that's something that also is part of her record. Also, I think it has to be recognised that she did genuinely give, despite both their failings at being unfaithful, she did genuinely give her husband strength in his years at Robben Island. So it would be difficult to see Mandela as the man he was without Winnie Mandela. That's something that perhaps needs to be recognised. Um, but I don't think that controversial side should be airbrushed. And those who say that, oh, it's a white perspective. Well, the ANC were critical of her role within the party and the divisive role that she was playing within the party. So that was something coming from the ANC. That wasn't just white critics pointing out the fact that she was a demagogue. The ANC was critical of Winnie Mandela. It's just that her popularity was such that they could not control her. I think she will be remembered as a formidable woman, very strong character, but a demagogue, arrogant, corrupt, and very cruel. I think she allowed her personal suffering to make her vindictive and vengeful. And if she had been president and not her husband, I think South Africa would have been in absolute civil war. Now, regarding South Africa today, keeping on the subject, um, there's no question about it. This is a country that suffers some very serious problems, and I don't want to sound like I'm vilifying the country. I'm sure South Africa, like every country, has many positive aspects. But let's call a spade a spade. South Africa has some serious problems, and I remember speaking to a white South African woman when I was working in China, and she was no proponent of apartheid, but she said that there was this prophecy within one of the black nations within South Africa. I forget which one it was, but it was that when Nelson Mandela died, the blacks would then rise up in revenge. Now that hasn't quite happened, but there is strong indication that there is racially motivated attacks on the white minority now taking place. And when you get the likes of Julius Malema, who's no longer associated with the ANC, but is unquestionably a future Robert Mugabe, if if he ever gets into power, that's disturbing. Um, the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, incidentally, just backtracking a little bit, found Winnie Mandela guilty of severe human rights abuses. So, this is not something that you could just say, oh, it's coming from an outside white guy or outside white journalist. This is the South African Truth and Reconciliation Committee itself, which included many ANC people. They found her guilty of human rights abuses because of the behaviour of the Mandela United Football Club. Um, if I was a South African, black or white, I would be deeply concerned about the future because this is a country that is looking very, very volatile. And ironically, just as there is some glimmer of hope in Zimbabwe with with Mugabe, with the, let's say, stepping down in Mugabe and the possibility of a better future in Zimbabwe, South Africa seems to be going backwards. So that's really sad, and it's really something that responsible South Africans, I think, need to be very, very wary of. It's not for me to tell South African people, black or white, how to vote or anything like that. But I hope that this new guy, I forget his name now, but the new president will really, he is not in an enviable position. Who would want to be president of South Africa right now? You have rampant crime rates, deeply embedded corruption, serious racial tensions. Um, who would want to be president of South Africa at this time? But I think South Africa is a great nation, or at least it has the potential to be a great nation. And I really, really hope that people can respect Nelson Mandela's legacy. Um, and look at a brighter future, look at a genuinely rainbow nation. And that might sound incredibly naive or even insulting, given the extraordinary crime rates, violent crime rates that are taking place right now. This is a very dangerous situation. And if I was a white farmer, I would be very nervous. There are some people, Pan Africanists, who are online saying, oh, it's justified because of years of colonialism. Well, then you're basically saying it's about revenge. At least admit it's about revenge. Be candid about that. Um, and what's revenge going to do? Well, firstly, there were many white South Africans who were opposed to apartheid. I'll give one example: Peter Hain, who's a British Labour Party former minister. He was, a forceful critic of apartheid. He was an active campaigner against apartheid. There were many brave white South Africans who were against it. So this sort of attitude that some Pan-Africanists take, that we must punish all the whites, it's a bit like certain black nationalists in the United States who want to punish all the whites. That regressive mindset is not going to help anybody. Um, so yeah, that's seems to be the situation in South Africa. Now, before I round up this video, just a quick word. Another prominent figure has passed away this weekend. Um, that is Efrain Rios Montt. Not particularly well known outside Central America, but he was one of the region's very worst dictators. He's right up there with some of the worst dictators of the 20th century, responsible for many of the acts of genocide against indigenous people during the brutal Guatemalan Civil War. And it's estimated in the year 1982 alone. In the UK, we know 1982 because of the Falklands War, but in that year alone, tens of thousands, possibly, of Guatemalans were slaughtered, many on his orders. He's passed away at the age of 91. He makes Pinochet look small fry. This guy really was one of the most brutal of all of not just Central America's dictators, I would say all of the Western Hemisphere's dictators. One of the very worst, and that will be his legacy. Guatemala has somewhat moved on. That brutal civil war ended in 1996, but there's no shortage of demagogues in the world today, and we need to learn from history, I think. But anyway, I'll round it up there. Montt wasn't that well known outside the region, and in a way, that's unfortunate because if history is to be written fairly, then all of the century's crimes, all of modern history's crimes, should be equally um, and proportionately covered. And the Guatemala Civil War, unfortunately, it's one of those forgotten conflicts, despite the fact a quarter of a million people perished, and many at the hands of this brutal dictator. Um, so we'll leave it there. I know this isn't a particularly cheery video, but I feel these are things that need to be said. Thank you for watching.